And so it's my pleasure to get us started today. Not really to introduce, I think everyone knows Catherine Malabou. In fact, I think most people actually know Catherine Malabou, since we have many EGS people here. And it's really not necessary for me to give any kind of introduction regarding her achievements and her important recent work. I just want to say, as always, it's a great pleasure to have her with us. We had a wonderful seminar last year, and it's wonderful that we can do this book discussion with her, which is in a series of book discussions. Again, I want to credit Nemanja Mitrovic for this idea and making it possible. As always, Nemanja is hiding in the background, and should we have any problems, he will surface. But just to assure you that there is technical expertise here somewhere. Anyway, thanks very much to Nemanja. And I thank Peter Szendy, who is joining us today as a second discussant. I'm not the first, I'm the second. I'm going to let Peter go first. But again, someone I think all of you know, or and whose work you're familiar with to some degree. He's been with us at EGS several times. He's speaking to us from Providence. He teaches at Brown University. And it is a really wonderful pleasure to have Peter with us. It's always that beautifully measured and articulated way of speaking, and a wonderful intelligence. So we will follow our usual format. Catherine will begin with a presentation. She'll discuss what she has been up to and perhaps where she's going. I'll see what she says. And then I will pass the screen to Peter, who will begin our discussion. He says he has an argument which he has formulated, and I look forward to hearing that. And then once he is finished, I will have some remarks of my own, perhaps a little less formal, but I'll try to follow up with a line of thinking or a kind of contribution. So with that, Catherine, would you like to begin?
Yes, of course. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you. And thank you, Chris and Nemanja, for organizing this discussion. And thank you, Peter, also for participating. So what I'll do is to to say a few words about the content of the book, because I know that many of you haven't read it yet. It just came out in the US. So I will, tell you about something about the content. So very quickly, I wrote this book for, let's say, two main reasons. First, in order to propose a certain type of diagnosis of the political and economic situation today. And second, in order to analyze a certain disavowal coming from contemporary philosophy vis-a-vis this situation. And these two reasons meet in one point, which is the state of contemporary anarchism. So I start with the first point, which is the diagnosis of the political and economic situation. In the book, I characterize this situation as a crisis that can be described as a crisis in horizontality. Such a crisis derives from the global coexistence of what we can call a de facto anarchism, a factual anarchism, and on the other hand, a dawning anarchism. And this coexistence makes it very difficult to achieve a rigorous distinction between resignation and initiative, forced as they are to walk now on the same ground. So why de facto anarchism? What do I call de facto anarchism? I use this term because the state has already disintegrated, offering nothing more than a protective envelope for the various oligarchies that have divided up the world between themselves. Everywhere, the social world is condemned to a horizontality of desertion. In economically privileged, supposedly democratic countries, the effect of the already long-standing collapse of the welfare state continue to circulate indefinitely. And it's clear that no state institution, no common parliamentary organization can respond to the challenges of poverty, migrations, and ecological or health crises in any way other than through pitiful emergency measures. As for the dawning anarchism this time, the actual collapse in the social meaning of verticality coincides with an emergent planetary consciousness signaled by the dramatic rise in collective initiatives and experiments in alternative political visions. I think, for example, in France, of the Gilets jaunes and the protestations against Macron's reform of pensions. It is clear that these new movements are based on self-generated collective modes of organization without any obedience to unions or parties. These alternative phenomena coincide exactly with what must be termed the anarchist turn in capitalism itself. So the de facto anarchism, in fact, coincides with an anarchist turn in capitalism itself. It's a turn that was born of the financial crisis of the 2000s, that marked the shift from neoliberalism to ultra-liberalism. The development of post-Fordist capitalism at the end of the 20th century was not yet fluent in the language that economic actors practice openly today, which is now the hegemonic language of anarcho-capitalism. So before I develop this point, I know that one might object that we are witnessing a global hardening of political interventionism that is inseparable from a new form of centralizing economic power. So why do I speak about an anarchist turn? Are we not facing an intensified political authoritarianism, the confiscating of wealth and profit by a handful of companies and conglomerates? Yes, we certainly are. And yet, when political commentators declare in all seriousness that Donald Trump is an anarchist, it was the title of an article published in the New Yorker, they are not using the words lightly. They are trying to articulate what the entire world is experiencing as a major crisis that can be formulated as the hybrid combination of government violence and an unending Uberization of life. Authoritarianism does not oppose the disappearance of the state. It is rather its messenger. It masks this so-called collaborative economy that every day erodes still further any fixed regulations by putting professionals and users in direct contact through technological platforms. So the political question that appears from there is to determine whether we can separate the horizontality of alternative political formations from the waistlines of anarcho-capitalism. How can we dig a difference at the surface between these two types of anarchism, such is, in my view, the new geographical, political, and philosophical challenge of the 21st century. So to just give you a few examples of this anarcho-capitalist turn, I quote Elon Musk, who recently declared, "If you must know, I'm a utopian anarchist." I'm also referring to Javier Milei, who won recently Argentina's presidency by wielding a roaring chainsaw on the campaign trail to symbolize the slashing he planned for the nation's government and state. And Milei declared himself, he's a self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalist. And his party is called Advanced Libertarians. So more and more presidents declare their proximity with cyber and anarcho-capitalism. That's the paradox. Like, we are the state, but at the same time, we don't need the state. So this is the first aim of the book, to try to make a diagnosis of this new reference to anarchism by the far right, mostly. So briefly, what is anarchism? I mean, this is a major question, this time revolutionary anarchism. Briefly defined, we can say that anarchism amounts to the radical rejection of domination. So this is revolutionary, dawning anarchism. Domination, a few words about that, is not simply mastery, authority, or power. Alienation, domination is subjection and alienation. It has no positive sides, and it is blurring the line between power and abuse of power. So anarchism is not and never has been simply an attack on the state. It is, in fact, an attack on domination, that is what they call government. And domination, in fact, exceeds the simple realm of political government. It also concerns, it affects all the domains of life, public, private, domestic, collective, individual. So now I'm turning to the second reason, which is philosophy. Why did I say in the beginning that there was a kind of disavowal of the current situation by philosophers? So I'm now coming to this point. I noticed that some prominent philosophers of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, have developed a strong concept of anarchy in their work, and even sometimes of anarchism. And I developed that point by reading 5 philosophers: Rainer Schürmann, Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, and Rancière, who all have, once again, a very strong concept of anarchy in their work. And they all agree with the revolutionary anarchists on the fact that what has to be fought against is domination. And yet, none of them have ever declared themselves anarchists in the political sense. In that sense, we can say that philosophical anarchy is an anarchy without anarchism. So that's the case for ontological anarchy or anarchism in Schürmann, anarchic responsibility in Levinas, archy writing in Derrida, anarchaeology in Foucault, destituent power or anarchy in Agamben, and radical equality or anarchism in Rancière. So none of them have ever made the leap toward political anarchism, and I'm wondering why. I just quote a sentence from Schürmann. Schürmann declares, needless to say, so he has a book called The Principle of Anarchy, and nevertheless he says, needless to say, here it will not be a question of anarchy in the sense of Proudhon, Bakunin, and their disciples. What these masters sought was to displace the origin, to substitute the rational power, principium, for the power of authority, principe, as metaphysical an operation as has ever been. So for them, anarchism in the revolutionary sense is just a metaphysical moment. It's just a metaphysical theory. So again, we have this paradox of an anarchy without anarchism, and it is true that we have no reading, we have no serious reading by philosophers of Proudhon, Kropotkin, Bakunin, Malatesta, etc. These people remain unread by the prominent philosophers of the 20th century. And I also want to add that if there's no shame, and never has been, for a philosopher to declare themselves a Marxist, it is almost indecent to call oneself an anarchist, since anarchism is immediately associated with the impossible, the violent, the unachievable, the terrorist, etc., etc. I quote Badiou. We know today that all emancipatory politics must put an end to the model of the party or of multiple parties in order to affirm a politics without party, and yet, at the same time, without lapsing into the figure of anarchism, which has never been anything else than the vain critique or the double or the shadow of the communist parties, just as the black flag is only the double or the shadow of the red flag, end of quote. So it's very paradoxical to the extent that not Badiou, but clearly Schürmann, Levinas, Derrida, Foucault, Agamben, and Rancière are undoubtedly closer politically to anarchism than to Marxism. So the question is, why do they disavow that? And I'm speaking of a disavowal in the Freudian sense, that is, as something unconscious, as a repression. So what should we make of philosophers who announce, I am not an anarchist, even when anarchy is everywhere to be found in their work and even has the last word? So what do they repress? And I will stop on that in the last moments of this presentation. What exactly is the problem? Why do they refuse to present themselves as anarchists? Why are they resisting to? Why are they resisting? In fact, I think that repression, what they repress, is the issue that is at the heart of the anarchist question, which is the political viability of the absence of government. Clearly, Proudhon was the first to say anarchism is the critique of government and the affirmation that people can self-organize and live politically without a government. And I think this is what philosophers cannot swallow. They cannot buy it. And in that sense, they critique domination, but at the same time, they accept governmental domination. And we can come back to that in the discussion. I can show for each of them how, in the end, they accept. They end up saying, okay, but we need to obey someone, because if we don't have a government, it's anarchy in the vulgar sense of the term. In fact, I think they all have a vision of political anarchism as a state of nature. I think that in that sense, they still partake the Hobbesian vision of anarchism as the state of nature. And this is visible in Derrida, for example, who associates anarchism with cruelty, sadism, war, general war, etc. My goal in that book was to analyze philosophically the current crisis in horizontality, the coexistence of the two anarchisms, and at the same time, analyze the philosophical disavowal of anarchism, so that I tried to bring some philosophy in anarchism and reciprocally some anarchism in philosophy. This is briefly explained what I tried to do in this book. I hope that was clear.
Very much. Thank you. I had to unmute there. Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. It's a very powerful presentation to begin. I think it's very, very compelling in terms of the landscape. So with that, I thank you. And then Peter, would you like to begin with your response?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you already for including me in this discussion of Catherine. It's really inspiring, provocative, and admirably inventive, actually, and also rigorous foray into this very contested territory of philosophical anarchism, an expression that I almost hear after reading you as an oxymoron. If we take seriously your argument that philosophy has never crossed the boundary separating anarchy from anarchy. So I actually have written something that has the shape of an argument that will lead, hopefully, sorry, to a question with actually two other questions that will arise while I go there. It will take 15 minutes or so. Announcing the path that you will follow in Stop Thief. You say, that's page 24, that after a chapter dedicated to Aristotle's Politics, the reading will take a sharp turn and will focus on the counter-revolutionary part concealed in several philosophical texts. Actually, these texts could be said to belong, as you just recalled, to an anarchic but not anarchist contemporary philosophical tradition. And indeed, the book sets out to read 6 contemporary philosophers, the ones you mentioned. They are, by the way, all men, and one could incidentally wonder why, especially if one thinks of your book that preceded Stop Thief by 2 years, that is to say, Pleasure Erased, which ends with a chapter titled Clitoris, Anarchy and the Feminine, where you emphasize that, I quote, anarchy and feminine are indissolubly linked. So as a kind of aside, before I get to the question I would like to ask you, I was wondering, are there women philosophers who reflected upon anarchy or anarchism, and whom you are interested in, who are part, so to speak, of your anarchist library? And I remember actually that some years ago in our conversations that are very dear to me and very important for me, you mentioned to me quite often, and always with a particular interest, Rosa Luxemburg, who makes only a very brief appearance. She's only mentioned in Stop Thief. I was also thinking of Simone Weil, who is often characterized as a Christian anarchist, and who published various articles, for example, in the French anarchist newspaper Le Libertaire. I was also thinking of Hannah Arendt, who is absent from your book. I'm sure that there are very good reasons for this. Not that Arendt is explicitly identified as an anarchist, but I was thinking of a precise passage in her book on revolution that I just want to mention quickly. Against the idea that, I quote, a people left without the constraint of its government would have anarchistic and lawless natural inclinations, she gives the example of the councils that appeared, for example, during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which is an example that is dear to me too, because my father was part of it. And she says that the councils were concerned with the reorganization of the political and economical life of the country and the establishment of a new order, which is the whole point and question, I believe, right? But still, she emphasizes the role of the councils as this crucial moment. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts about these political thinkers in particular, and about anarchy and gender more generally, because after all, in a word like, patriarchy, there might be a sort of redundancy or complicity between the suffix archy and the root. Well, we could also ask questions then what about matriarchy? But that's an aside, not really an aside. It's a question. I move on, and I want to focus on what will be my main question, which is the question of reading. So as I mentioned, Stop Thief, which is really a fascinating book. Stop Thief presents itself as a reading, lecture, that sets out to analyze the reasons why thinkers who develop strong concepts of anarchy ultimately, as you say, take refuge in the protective wings of arche, end of quote. And very strikingly, in the sentence that announces the movement of thought of the book, the grammatical subject is reading itself. I quote again this sentence, it's on page 24. Taking a sharp turn, the reading lays bare the counter-revolutionary parts concealed in several philosophical texts. So indeed, I'm tempted to argue that reading is the main actor or agency, in a way, the acting persona in Stop Thief. What we read in Stop Thief are often readings. In the chapter that you dedicate to Rainer Schürmann, we thus read, I quote, his readings of Plotinus and Foucault. And it is in order to characterize the first of these readings, so Schürmann's reading of Plotinus, that you offer the expression, I quote, event-based reading of the principle. That's the English translation. In French, it's la lecture événementielle, right, of the principle, which is an expression that, to my ears, strongly resonated with another one in a sort of distant but very distinct echo. in your first first published book, The Future of Hegel, there is an important section, and a section that is particularly dear to me, titled The Event of Reading, l'événement de la lecture. So I started to wonder, what can we hear in the resonance between these two expressions, lecture événementielle, eventive reading, we can translate, and événement de lecture, the event of reading. What can we hear in what strikes me as their rigorous, gesturing towards one another over the distance of actually many years? The Future of Hegel was 1996, and Stop Thief is 2022. So on the one hand, there is what I would describe as reading for anarchy or anarchism, or for anarchism behind anarchy, hidden by it. So on the one hand, there is reading as let's say, an auscultation in search of anarchism, in search of its repressed or silenced rumor. What Schurman does, for example, by practicing what you call a lecture événementielle, an eventive reading, is bring to the fore the non-foundational nature of the principle in Plotinus, of the one. And so what Schurman does is letting the eventive nature of the principle emerge, so that the event is what the reading produces, what the reading reveals, right? That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, there might be the notion of an anarchic reading, what I am tempted to call an anarchy reading, that would not only and not even necessarily bring forth anarchy as a concept, but would rather be intrinsically anarchist or anarchic as a reading practice, right? Practicing or experiencing anarchy in the very act or process of reading. So if, as you write in Stop Thief, anarchism is, I quote, the only political form that is always to be invented, to be shaped before it exists, precisely because it depends on no beginning or command. And if anarchism is never what it is, if, as you also say, plasticity is the meaning of anarchism's being, the meaning of its question, then anarchy reading could be the name for a reading that is in and of itself an event, an événement de lecture. Now, what would such an anarchic or anarchist reading be? What would it look like? Reading your book, reading Stop Thief, I was tempted to imagine it at a certain point along the lines of what Derrida says in a passage from Force of Law that you briefly consider and discuss before deciding then to focus on Derrida's reading of Freud and his reading of the drive for power that's in Derrida's postcard, the postcard. So in Force of Law, in the passage that you quote and discuss, Derrida writes, that's the passage you quote yourself. He says, what we might say then, that there is a possibility of general strike, a right to general strike in any interpretative reading, the right to contest established law in its strongest authority, the law of the state, end of quote. And in the next paragraph, Derrida adds, I quote again, for there is something of the general strike, grève générale, and thus of the revolutionary situation in every reading that founds something new and that remains unreadable in regard to established canons and norms of reading, end of quote. You identify in Derrida's stance, Derrida's position towards anarchism, actually quite irritating oscillation between yes and no. Right? I am an anarchist, but no, I'm not an anarchist, but yes, I'm an anarchist. Well, you diagnose, so to speak, this in your book. I am also struck in this passage that you quote by the fact that reading, when he mentions reading here, it's not really reading. Reading is actually a mere synonym for writing. because he talks about a reading that founds, that is foundational, a reading that becomes foundational, and above all, about a reading that remains unreadable. So a reading that remains unreadable and a reading that is foundational, what else is it if not reading by metaphor, reading that has become archic, right? Reading that has turned or coagulated into writing. So funnily, ironically maybe, reading as general strike, which is such a wonderful idea, only lasts in Derrida's argument for a few sentences before reading is really put to work again, right? So my question is, what would an anarchy reading look like if it were to be a lasting one and not merely a step towards a new foundational writing? And I guess that this might sound like the stubborn and irritating question that anarchism always faces. How long can it last as such, as anarchism, before you will see it will turn into a new foundation? And so maybe this question, this irritating question, when it actually comes to reading and reading as general strike, this question should be reformulated, maybe as follows. What would an anarchy reading look like if it resists solidifying into a statement? Or if reading inhabits the form of a statement, but a statement that keeps in itself the very motion or becoming of enunciation, right? Indeed, between the notion of eventive reading, lecture événementielle, as we find it in Stop Thief, and the event of reading, événement de lecture, as conceptualized in The Future of Hegel, there is a difference that could be captured, I hope, I believe, by a distinction often used in Lacan. It's a distinction that Lacan borrowed at least partly from Benveniste, and it's the distinction between the subject of the statement and the subject of enunciation. Lacan relies on it, for example, in his Kant with Sade, when he talks about Sade's categorical imperative of absolute freedom to enjoy. And by the way, that is also an incidental question. I don't know, maybe you will want to say something about it. Sade, in some of his writings, or at least through the voice of some of his characters, Sade might be one of the strongest advocates for anarchy, maybe before Proudhon, I don't know. I am thinking of, for example, one of Sade's characters, who is ironically the chief of police, a certain Guigi in Histoire de Juliette, who gives a long speech where he defends anarchy, actually, in the following terms. I put just one sentence. Guigi, the chief of police, says, "Never are tyrants born of anarchy. You see them flourish only behind the screen of the law or attain supremacy by means of it, basing their authority upon law." End of quote. But again, I leave Sade aside, though I would be really curious to know your thoughts about his anarchism, if it is one. And I was also struck that you briefly mentioned in your presentation, in your introduction, that Derrida associates anarchism and sadism, which I find really interesting. But so let me focus on reading as event, right? On the événement de lecture. So what would it mean, I would like to ask, for anarchy to happen, to be encountered, not so much as the subject of a statement, anarchy being this or that. For example, you say at a certain point that anarchy is a tool for Schürmann, for Rainer Schürmann. You say anarchy is a tool to read Heidegger. Anarchy is this, or anarchy is that. Not so much anarchy as the subject of a statement, but rather what would it mean for anarchy to affect the subject of the very enunciation of this statement. Right? Now, in order to approach this question as it pertains to reading, I would like to consider briefly the wonderful pages of Stop Thief's conclusion, the amazing pages, where you auscultate a statement. The statement is, one cannot be an anarchist. And you really auscultate it by shifting the emphasis from one word to another. It actually reminded me, maybe for, I mean, in the form of what you're doing, but maybe with opposite effects or for opposite reasons, it reminded me of what Heidegger does in The Principle of Reason, when he shifts the emphasis in Leibniz's Latin sentence, nihil est sine ratione. And so you have first the emphasis on nihil and sine, and then on est and ratione. And this is the whole movement of the book. So when you emphasize the last three words of the statement, one cannot be an anarchist. You write, I quote, this is page 210, anarchy proves to be more originary than ontology, exceeding ontological difference itself. Its saying exceeds its said, overflows the propositional form infinitely. End of quote. So here you use the lexicon of Levinas's philosophy, saying and said, dire and die. But I think that maybe it's not completely wrong to translate what you say for the purpose of my argument in terms of enunciation and statement. Indeed, you actually put it yourself in these terms, I believe, when you write later in the same conclusive chapter, I quote again, page 214, you say, to state I am an anarchist is no longer a matter of logic. Subject, copula, predicate, all lose their function immediately in the statement because the anarchism of being relieves the anarchist from having to become the subject of its anarchy. End of quote. I really think that we could, and maybe we should, dedicate a whole seminar just to unwrap this fascinating sentence that sounds to my ears like an anarchist anti-cogito. It seems to say, I am an anarchist, therefore I am not what I am, or therefore I am not but I become, therefore I am an event, or therefore, to borrow a concept that you have worked really deeply with, I am an anarchist, therefore I am an epigenesis of myself. I cannot even begin to do justice to this sentence now, but what I want to do is let it guide us to the last part of my approach to Stop Thief, and hence to my main question, after the question of gender in anarchist thought and the question of SAD as a possible precursor. So to the question that I am laboriously trying to formulate. So bear with me just one more minute, two, not more. You state a number of times in Stop Thief that anarchy is also a matter of propositional grammar or syntax. And as we know, syntaxis in Greek is, first of all, a military term that refers to a hierarchical battle order. Let me just take two samples, two quotes from Stop Thief that will suffice here. First, I quote, the attributive relation is the archetype of power. That's on page 42. Or in a more developed formulation on page 43, I quote, the relation of the general to his soldiers, just like that of the governing to the governed, is the objective translation of the predicative relation, which affixes the pros hen schema. Pros hen means in Greek towards the one, which affixes the pros hen schema in relation to power. Predicates and accidents stoop, you write, se courbe, almost they bow, you know. Predicates and accidents stoop before the instance from which they are derived, end of quote. Now, in the future of Hegel, when you analyze in a fascinating and rigorously thought-provoking way Hegel's account of the difficulty of philosophical texts, the famous passage in his preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, you show that the kind of reading, I'm tempted to say the regime of reading, to use a political lexicon, the regime of reading that Hegel identifies as proper to philosophical thought, to speculative thought, is a reading that is prevented from conforming to the syntactic stooping or bowing of the predicates before the unity of the subject. It's a very dense and difficult passage that you unwrap luminously, really, in the future of Hegel. More or less, the way I can sum it up is as follows. Since in the speculative proposition, the subject and the predicate, like in the proposition God is being, right? The subject and the predicate are identical or equal, dynamically identical or equal. Reading, far from conforming to a movement towards the one, reading becomes, you say, a series of shocks and countershocks that push the reader from the predicate back to the subject and vice versa. And you say, I quote the Future of Hegel, page 178, the reader experiences a loss of ground and foundation, une perte de sol et de base. End of quote. So such is the process of what you call plastic reading. That's page 181 of the Future of Hegel. And as a result, you say in a really striking aside in the Future of Hegel, in a parenthesis that is literally unfathomable, I quote, this is a mind-blowing parenthesis, you say, a first reading never happened. The first reading never happened. So my question, I guess, is very simple, if you allow me to say so. My question is, would you agree that plastic reading, in as much as it is an event of reading, is an anarchic reading, maybe an anarchist reading, at any rate, a reading without ground or foundation, a reading without beginning, in a word, a reading without arche. Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful book, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. This is really mind-blowing. You know, thank you so much. It's beautiful. I'm not sure I can answer everything. I'll try. So, Chris, should I answer now, or where's Chris? Is he with us?
I have to unmute. Yes, we didn't decide that in advance, but let us go ahead. Why don't you answer while these questions are fresh and these beautiful questions are so imposing. We all want an answer.
Yes, they are extremely imposing.
So why don't you go ahead and then I'll follow after the exchange. I think we have time.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I'm really embarrassed because this is a real text. I mean, this is an authentic text that Peter has written. And of course, it would take time for me to go through all the questions and analyses. In reality, I think, thank you so much for mentioning the 2 points, let's say, in my trajectory. First, in the Future of Hegel, the idea of an event of reading that I define as plastic reading in the Future of Hegel, and in the recent book on anarchism, event-based reading. In fact, contrarily to what may appear at first, there are many points of passage between Hegelianism and anarchism. And the more I go through these questions and the more these similarities appear to me and are imposing themselves convincingly on me. Reading is, of course, a political act, first of all, because it is the very form, I mean, this is how it is presented in school as the very means to obedience. And this is precisely what Lévi-Strauss says and that Derrida challenges so hard in Of Grammatology, that everybody is supposed to be able to read the law And so in that sense, reading is, of course, on the one hand, a means of emancipation, of course, of enlightenment, but also, and perhaps mostly, an element of domination. We know how to read in order to obey. In that sense, there's a common point between Hegel and the anarchist, which is that the law is precisely illegible, unreadable, because the structure of obedience, that is, as you said, that is comprehended in the proposition, that is a subject, a copula, and a predicate, which is a governor and a subordinate, a master and a slave, so to speak. The master is the subject, the slave is the predicate. Immediately, Hegel says this structure is, well, destroys itself. And philosophy makes that very clear, which is that because when we try to read a philosophical proposition, like God is being, this is the example you gave, then we discover that God is being are three ways of saying the same thing, which means that the structure of obedience is immediately destroyed by the very explosion that occurs at the grammatical level. So in that sense, for Hegel, the plastic reading is a reading that is not obedient. And in that sense, it pushes the reader to invent their own version of the law that emerges from a destruction of the ordinary structure of the proposition. That's why, for many people, Hegel himself is illegible. The difficulty of Hegel's text is not that much because of technical terms, because there are no technical terms in Hegel, really. It's because the structure of the sentence is precisely forbidding the usual trajectory of obedience, reading as obedience, like we start with the subject, then we go to the predicate. We start with the master, then we go to the slave. And we have the same problem with anarchism, which is that, in fact, what Proudhon shows in What is Property, which is the first time when anarchism is endowed with a positive meaning and not with a negative one, Proudhon says this word is illegible, it's unreadable, because exactly like in Hegel, anarche means master and the absence of master, the counter master, or the and Rancière will play with that in the ignorant master. This is exactly, I mean, the notion of ignorant master is exactly the definition of an anarchist for Rancière. Anarchism is very difficult to read because it's a contradictory term. So in that sense, here also, in order to read an anarchist text, we have to invent what we read, and in that sense, to make the usual structure of reading explode. The second thing I want to say is that in both cases, the transformation of the usual way of reading, of the linear way of reading and the hierarchical way of reading, master, copula, and slave, also implies that we can't read alone. We need someone else. And I think, Peter, you also talk about that in your book on reading, that the reading is never just between a text and a reader. We need a third person. In Hegel, this is the mediation. It's a collective reading, so to speak. We need someone else. We need a third term, which is the other reader. And in Proudhon, we need the witness, what I call the witness in the book, because without this third term, the new meaning of the sentence, I mean, the dismantling of the traditional logic would not be intelligible. So we need to be several in order to decipher the paradoxical structure of reading and of the law. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, which is that, in fact, the two moments in my trajectory, Hegel and anarchism, are, in fact, very, I think, profoundly related. I want also to answer your very important question about how can we avoid, if I recapitulate maybe clumsily, how can we avoid an anarchist statement to become a statement precisely, that is to become another law, how can we avoid its solidification into something that is not anarchist? I think this is the problem that people like Laclau and Mouffe address in their book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. They say that in every statement, there's always something floating. Is their theory of the floating signifier. There's always and they also, they don't use the term anarchist, but they use libertarian. They affirm that in every sentence, and this is what allows for the plastic reading, for the invention of something, the invention of a text, there's always a point where signification disappears, when there's a gap in signification. And I think this is what prevents an anarchist proposition to become a statement. There's always a point in a sentence that allows for its deconstruction, that allows for its transformation by the plastic reading. The problem is that in Laclau and Mouffe, this grounds their theory of hegemony. Hegemony meaning that we can all access to this floating signifier. The floating signifier has the power of gathering the readers, but the problem is the term hegemony, that in my view is way too much authoritarian. But this is another problem. There is also women, the question of women that you asked in the beginning. Of course, this is a true question. Of course, you know, I know there's this tradition of anarcha-feminism, and there's a recent book by Claudia Baracci that just came out about yes, anarcha-feminism, and there are some women anarchists, but honestly, when it comes to philosophy, there are not more women philosophers, women anarchist philosophers than men anarchist philosophers. I mean, briefly speaking, there are practically no anarchist philosophers, be they male or female. Michael Bakunin, who was trained as a philosopher, just threw philosophy away at some point. It's very difficult, and this is another task we would have to do. I was talking about the denial, disavowal of anarchism by philosophy, and we should also interrogate the denial of philosophy by anarchists. They say that philosophy is theoretical, it's against practice, etc. So I don't think we can find that many women anarchists, I mean, and philosophers. Arendt, of course, there is the passage on the councils that are very interesting, of course, but she clearly says, I'm not an anarchist. I mean, we need a government. We need an overarching structure over the councils. She says, I don't believe in anarchy. So, and Weil, of course, Simone Weil, I see what you mean, but her Christianity is so prominent that here also I have problems to really see her as an anarchist. I have two more remarks, one on Sade. It has been, Foucault and Deleuze has been, mostly Foucault, has been asked, how can you define yourself as an archaeologist with your fascination for BDSM, with your fascination for that type of sexuality that relies on sadism? Isn't it violent? Isn't it? And Foucault, he has a very interesting text on that. that says the difference between BDSM and cruelty, or I mean effective violence and cruelty, is that the BDSM always relies on a contract. It relies on a consent. And it's true that I've read things about that. It's true that there are a series of codes and there are gestures that you can make in order to stop the game, so to speak. And Deleuze also defends the idea that a certain form of sadism is anarchist to the extent that it relies on a contract, horizontal contract. When Sade himself defends anarchy, it's very ambiguous. We don't know exactly what kind of anarchism he defends. Is it the one that Foucault is talking about, like contract? Or is it more the one that we see in Pasolini's Salo? I'm not sure. I think Sade is a very ambiguous figure because in his books, there are no contracts. There's a kind of contract between the torturers, but there are victims that are not consentant. So Sade is very ambiguous, I would say. And the last thing, I would like to refer to a movie by Noah Teschner. It's a recent movie called Unruhe in German. Unruhe means, on the one hand, torment, revolt, and it means non-quietness. So revolt, politically speaking, but it is also the little movement of the watch, you know, the mechanical thing that turns like that and allows for the watch to function. And it's a parallel between the birth of anarchism in the French Jura, where all the factories, the watch factories were, and Teschner shows the coexistence of the birth of anarchism and the birth of the watch. That is the birth of time, measured by very precise watches, because it happens in the Jura, which is close to Switzerland. And I would perhaps enlarge this to the problem of writing. And this would, of course, necessitate a larger discussion, that maybe knowing how to read anarchist text is also a way to read time, to read what is coming, to read, as you said, the possibility of the event through a text. So yes, these are my remarks. I'm sorry, because they are disorganized a little bit and they don't do justice to your amazing text.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This is so rich. There are so many things. Really, just a few words. May I, Chris?
Yes, of course. Absolutely.
I've seen the movie Unruhe,
Ah,
which is
oui.
brilliant
It's
movie.
really nice. Huh?
Incredible, incredibly slow-paced, and you always have the feeling that you're waiting for something to happen. It's an incredible movie. I wouldn't be able to really speak about it now, but
Yeah, well, we should one day we should try to analyze it. Absolutely.
that would be wonderful. Yeah. I would really
Yeah.
love that. I'm really deeply struck and interested by what you said about reading as always implying, always calling for more than two, right? More than one, but
It
more
seems
than
that
two.
you said something like that in your own book.
I do, and actually, I'm so happy that we have this conversation, because in a way, what you write about reading in The Future of Hegel, and in Stop Thief, and in between, also in Before Tomorrow, when you talk about reading as a sort of figure or metaphor, but it's more than that. For epigenesis, you talk about that.
Yes, yeah.
You insist, actually, I was also very interested in the fact that in Before Tomorrow, you insist on the fact, you ask the question, how should we read epigenesis? And you say that epigenesis is often read in a genetic way, whereas you say
Exactly.
it should be read epigenetically.
At the surface, yeah.
I see a sort of dotted line, in your
This is truth. Yes, thank you. I forgot about that. Yeah, absolutely.
the future
Yes,
of Hegel to stop thief, and it's really
and epigenesis, yes.
yeah. Anyway, I wanted to say something, but I've lost my thread now. Yes, no, just quite simply that what you say, what you write about reading has constantly been on my mind, and I have the feeling that finally we are starting to have a
To
conversation.
have a discussion about that, yeah.
Long, that has always been there, but that's all.
But thank you so much for having pointed that. I was not really aware of that, in fact, that Stop Thief was so much about reading. The future of Hegel, yes, I knew that because I theorized it, etc. But the second one, the most recent one, I didn't know. I wasn't aware of that. So thank you. Yeah, it's true.
We have a kind of conversation to come about this anarchist, because the question of anarchic and anarchist, the difference is also a question in reading, so there are actually anarchistic practices of reading. One of them, which is really interesting, I don't know the English equivalent, it's called in French
L'arpentage is this one?
Arpentage, yes, arpentage. And so this is so interesting compared, I mean, in regard of what you said, that reading always needs several readers, because l'arpentage is actually what the arpenteur do, almost in a Sadian way, with the book, not among themselves, but with the book. They tear the book apart, and everyone reads a part of it.
Really?
And they share contractually, in a way, their reading. So I don't know. It has. I mean, we have to talk about this. I to know what you think. And okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Fantastic. This is this kind of event, between you two is what we dream for these meetings. So I thank you very much, both of you. And as always, Catherine, I'm sitting and marveling at your capacity to draw forth so many texts and things that you've worked through, and to have such a command of so much material. It's always a pleasure to experience that. And I experience it in the book too, which is which is immensely provocative and very, very, very arresting. There were a couple moments like when I first examined the table of contents, I said, "Oh my God, Agamben and Ancière." But you got me through these two painful encounters. Ancière in particular, by talking about Lyotard, and I want to try to take up that thread a little bit and going forward. No, there were many. I was delighted to see the work on Schumann. Schumann is so important. I think has not received enough attention in our theoretical circles, if I can put it that way. And I think he's emerging as an important figure, and I think you've done a lot in that respect. So, thank you so much for that. Cogent, powerful analyses of Derrida and Levinas. It's a very rich and very provocative text, and I want to thank you sincerely for that, and thank you for being willing to talk about it today. It's really I think it's very stimulating for all of us. I did want to follow this line with regard to Lyotard a bit. I'm actually going to do it via Heidegger, but I had a first question which maybe you want to address, or maybe not. There's a side of there's a playful, provocative side to your writing, which I always enjoy, and I don't know how intentional it is, but it's there. And it seems to me that when you accuse these philosophers of such a grave fault of failing to think anarchism, I wonder, I want to ask, is it really so bad a fault? Is it that it's worth calling them thieves? And I don't have an answer to this. Is not a point of contention. It's a question, because I find myself asking, okay, so if each of these authors believe that anarchism remains caught within metaphysics, and each one of them is in some way devoted to undoing metaphysics and releasing some other potential, it would seem almost natural that they would not take it up. And then, of course, you point to the way in which there does seem to be a sort of disavowal. There's a strange silence in their text with regard to them, and I totally accept that. But I find myself asking, is it so bad? And the question then that comes to my mind is, this is a very interesting statement about intellectual history. I mean, you see this as a really serious injustice, or at least you present it that way, and it's a fault committed with regard to intellectual history, and this is where I bring in my question. Well, is it so bad? I mean, is that this kind of thievery goes on all the time in intellectual history? I mean, this is sort of the stuff of intellectual history, right? It's constant theft, stealing, suppression, denial, alteration, and so forth. And is this disavowal, or this theft? I mean, it's just one instance of plagiarism among endless instances of plagiarism, which is part of what constitutes the tradition. And then, as we come into the era of AI, which is, I think Chomsky describes as the biggest machine for plagiarism ever imagined, I begin to wonder about this particular fault. And I think in relation to this fault, what about bad thought? What about the bad uses of other texts, the dull uses, the repressive institution uses, the uninteresting? Isn't that worse? So anyway, this is a first question, and maybe you want to address this motif of thievery with respect to intellectual history. That's sort of what's behind that first little remark.
Should I answer?
Go ahead. I want to go in.
Yeah, no, that's fundamental what you're asking. I wouldn't say it is plagiarism exactly. It's not that. It's more complicated than that. First of all, I think that you cannot use these terms anarchy, even just anarchy. You cannot use it as if you didn't know where it comes from. When they all use it, they all make use of it. It doesn't fall from the sky, and they perfectly know that. Of course, this is not something you invent and like, oh, let's call that anarchy. They perfectly know where it comes from, and they don't say it. And they so it's more than plagiarism. It's I call that theft. It's it's a violent gesture. It's not only, okay, we're taking all the arguments from the anarchists without saying it. It's more than that, because what they say is that, well, they take all the arguments from the anarchists, but also they say anarchism is not viable, anarchism is naive, anarchism is metaphysical. So it's a double gesture of perhaps some plagiarism, if you want, but also this contempt and this condemnation of anarchism. So it's worse than that. It's extremely violent. And it's all the more surprising that, I mean, all of them are very close to anarchism. I think that the frontier between what they do and what the anarchists say is very thin. So it's more than just there's something here like a twist, that a very strange psychoanalytical twist, that is very strange. And I think also that why is anarchism so ill considered, and why, and this is what I would like to do in my next book, why this exaltation for communism, mostly in French philosophy, and this contempt for anarchism. It is more than just plagiarism, I would say.
No, it's yeah, and I raised that question as out of interest. You know,
Yeah, I understand, and you're right to ask.
And I see, you know, I mean, I think I understand what's also behind your argument is that this question of the relations between government dominance, power, and oppression. You know, this is the red line running through this question, right? And it's not being sufficiently addressed in your argument. The reading is not produced in relation to the anarchists for the topic. And so yeah, it's a very interesting thing.
You remember when Foucault, after his lecture on what is critique, he attacks the government, and so someone asks him after, "Are you an anarchist, Foucault?" And he says, "No. I said something like, we have to criticize the government, but we need a little bit of government." You know, there's this.
You know, I was thinking about Schumann in relation to this question, and I wrote to an EGS student who's writing a PhD touching on Schumann. This is Francesco Guercia, and Francesco, I said, was Schumann associated with any of the political movements in New York relating to AIDS activism?
Yeah.
So, for example, ACT UP would be a very interesting case in relation to this topic. He said, well, nobody really knows. There's no evidence of this. But he said he did cite, and I hope Francesco won't mind my mentioning this. He cited a statement that Schumann made in an interview in which he said, if he were in a regime like that of Pol Pot, which was such a disappointment to him and his colleagues when it took shape, then he would accept anarchism in its bloody sense. And so there's an interesting avowal at that point that comes up in relation to this topic.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit, but it's there's so little, you know, in terms of what we have. But I was very struck too, you know, thinking about both Schumann and Foucault. We have people who died of AIDS, and who were sort of acutely aware of this, let's just say, undercurrent with respect to established authority and government.
Oh, yes.
Moment, you know, in terms of practices and activities and so forth. Okay.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
So I let me see. I hope I don't want to go too far afield. We don't have that much time, and I've said that I enjoyed very much what you said about Schumann, and I won't go into that. I just wanted to pick up quickly in Foucault something, and that was your way of developing an anarchist potential from his thinking about the relation to parrhesia and the care of the self in the later work, and particularly in the text, The Courage of Truth. And I was really frustrated because I promised myself to get to that material at some point many years ago, 35 years ago, when I first started reading those late lectures. And I recognized that Foucault was drawing heavily upon a motif in Heidegger, which is the motif of usage, of use.
Okay.
It is, of course, you know, he's referring to a set of Greek texts, but as a reader as strong of Heidegger as strong as Foucault was, cannot not have been aware of what,
of course, yeah,
the notion of usage. And this is, I think that this topic could potentially open to a more horizontal understanding of power relations than one would normally expect from Heidegger, for example. And but for this, one really does have to read through the text as a whole. I remember my one conversation with Schumann, it was very precious to me. We discussed our relations to being in time, and I said, I don't agree with you. You don't read back to front, you read front to back. In other words, you start with being in time and then you go from there. And he said, no, you start from the end and you go back and you deconstruct. And but what I was trying to talk about there was about the question of Mitsein and relationality and the pragmatics of relation, which I think are so important in the existential analytic and which get carried through Heidegger's text from beginning to end. So this notion of usage for Heidegger, it appears early in his thinking about pragmatics, but it really comes to the fore in the 30s when he's starting from the reading of Hölderlin, who really introduces this thought, I think, in a powerful way. But then it starts to come forward very strongly in 1935. Heidegger, the Introduction to Metaphysics, he makes a very strong statement: being needs human being in order to come about. There can be no event without the relation between being and human being. And he says being needs and uses human being. And the verb there is brauchen.
Yes, yeah.
It comes up very significantly in all of the texts. So again, through the 30s into the 40s, you have something like the Anaximander fragment. Into the 50s, something like the question concerning technology, and then the language essays, all the way to his very last essay. He's talking about usage, and it's always it's a destabilizing relation. In that you might think that the ontologically prior is always needing the what is dependent upon it, or is that what it uses. So in Foucault, in the passages you were citing, it tends to be a relation of the self to itself, which opens upon alterity. In Heidegger, it is the usage defines relation in general. All relation, and all relation is thereby destabilized. So I think that this is why I say that you could perhaps find an possibility in working with that.
Can I say something? May I say something?
Go ahead, and I will.
I mean, this is so interesting. Thank you so much, because I never related, because what is interesting is that Proudhon, in What is Property, says that we should defend usage against property. And in anarchist thinking, you have a very strong concept of usage as precisely what opens relations, so that we could build a bridge. And I'm sure that Sherman knew that, but he doesn't say it. Usage is a very strong anarchistic motif.
Yeah, it has immense potential that way. And
Yes.
You can see that even in Wittgenstein.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then we go into forms of life and various pragmatisms, which are quite plastic, we could say.
Absolutely.
So I was going to address this with relation to the question of power.
Yes.
And power and capacity, and in that sense, ultimately something like government and domination. And what I wanted to pick up is the way in which, in Heidegger, Heidegger sees the Dasein's relation to itself as overall as one of being able or being capable. And this comes to its culmination, you might say, in the statement that Dasein is capable of its death, even its possible impossibility.
True.
But that capacity is actually, when it's most, you might say, authentically realized, it opens upon its own limit, which is a powerlessness, and that is the relation to what he calls thrownness. Thrownness, or what in Being in Time, he'll refer to it as birth. Birth is a kind of abyss for the Dasein. And insofar as every act of understanding is, you might say, projected between birth and death, birth is always marking the relation that is assumed in the act of projection or in the Dasein's understanding of being. So there is always a dimension of powerlessness. And Heidegger will say, in Being in Time, he's talking, this is in the section on the conscience, he says, the Dasein is never capable of bringing its own thrownness into its capacity, I might say. So there's a not, a never that is constantly marking the Dasein. And in a later essay, The Essence of Ground, he will say that the freedom of the Dasein does not extend to its own origin in the opening of temporality. So that there is a limit to freedom of a similar kind. And in each case, what we're dealing with is the finitude of the Dasein. And this finitude introduces a powerlessness that is always present in Heidegger's thinking. Now, this is, of course, this is where reading is required, because we've got another dimension of Heidegger, which is quite frightening in terms of the effort to think a dominance, you might say. But this thread runs through all of the text. And it emerges quite dramatically. I just wanted to mention this in relation to Schumann. It emerges in the late thinking on releasement, because Heidegger will declare there that truth requires, again, this is the notion of uses, truth requires the human being. And why is that? And he says in a very lapidary way, because human being has no power over truth. And so we must thereby think human being always from the aletheic event, inscribed in the aletheic event, where there's always concealment, always incapacity and powerlessness. And it seems to me that in trying to think the relation to otherness that you evoke near the end of your text, this kind of what can I say? This awareness, this thought is, I think, is quite pertinent, and it is. It's particularly, for me, it's particularly interesting if we then take it forward with someone like Lyotard, who turns in his late work, in particular, to a thought of infancy. And there he's trying to theorize this powerlessness and what the relation to powerlessness gives to the human being. For this, he brings in a notion, he speaks of the soul. And the soul is what in human beings suffers the finitude of being. It suffers the relation to being born and thrownness and powerlessness and the debt that comes about there, because we never get past our thrownness. We are always in debt in some sense, and so he speaks of this as a relation that is suffered by the soul in the human being. Now, if you look at there's a text. I'm guessing you're aware of this one, or it's very pertinent to what you're trying to do with the notion of the ungovernable or non-governable. Excuse me. It's a text called Unbeknownst. And in the French, it's à l'insu. It starts with
Where is it published?
And I just pulled out the English because I was going to read from it, but it's in Postmodern Fables. Okay. It was, I don't know, I think it was published in 1988 in a collection which had some link to Nicole Leroux's work. Okay. He presented it at the Miami University in the context of a discussion of community when that was becoming very significant. And actually, he was fighting with Ernesto Laclau on that occasion. I was sitting next to him, listening to him complain through Laclau's discussions. But anyway, it is a very interesting text, and what he does there is argue that the relation to finitude that I'm talking about, and I've just sketched, I've just alluded to it, but the relation to finitude I'm talking about, and this suffering of powerlessness, is what, in some sense, constitutes what Freud would call a malaise dans la civilisation, a discomfort or a disquiet, unruhe, perhaps in civilization. Yes. And he says that what is the effort at domination other than an effort to repress and control this? So, and he has, in the first pages, he talks about totalitarian efforts to impose unity over something that is in fact non-governable and cannot be brought into some unified totality. So it's a very beautiful statements there about this relation to powerlessness, which again has to do with, as he says, in human finitude, birth and death, and hence a certain ground of community. And this is where, if we had time, I'd be talking about Blanchot, because I think Blanchot gives us an anarchic thought of community that has a political dimension to it, and this would be a path to take. But anyway, with Lyotard, there's another aspect to it. Again, he theorized this increasingly as the mind's or the soul's relation to its infancy. And he said part of that relation is also an openness to what in the infant is a kind of extraordinary imaginative capacity, an extraordinary plasticity, an extraordinary freedom of fantasy and fictioning. And from there, if you read the essay on Arendt, you'll see him claiming that it is in the relation to infancy that we can draw the kind of freedom of invention that you are talking about at the end of your text.
Interesting, yeah.
So you have in this, again, this relation to powerlessness, also the opening of an inventiveness or a fabulation or a fictioning. And so I think that my intention here in thinking of these references to other texts is simply to work with what you offered and with things that resonate in my own interests. And I'm just so happy to. Well, first of all, I'm happy to see you in your text. These days, that's rare. And but was very happy to see the pages on Lyotard, which
I have a love for Lyotard, an immense respect and love, and yes, and thank you so much for reminding us of all these references. And I think that in Lyotard, more than in Heidegger, powerlessness is also a power, which is, as you said, a capacity for invention, creativity. And this is something you also have in anarchism. Anarchists don't say we are powerless. They say we are powerless in a certain sense because we reject a governmental power, but we are powerful as well, as anarchists, precisely. And I think there's something like that in Lyotard, more than in Heidegger.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And that was very early in Lyotard. I don't know when we date that essay, but La Force des Faibles is back when he was reading rhetoric. So that's got to be in the early 70s, early to mid 70s. And
there's also this text on cinema, La Cinema, where he says that he invents a kind of anarchist cinema.
Yes.
Text La Cinema in one word.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah, these were just associations that were things that were ringing for me, and again, I'm very grateful for that. And I'm going to go back to these anarchist texts to try to think about usage, and also back to Foucault. I'm finally going to get to the Courage of Truth to read that a little bit more thoroughly and closer attention, because you've really opened up, I think, the importance of that. So thank you. We had set for this an hour and a half, and we just hit an hour and a half. Should we perhaps? It's very difficult for us to handle 65 or 70 people with questions. So I think that perhaps our protocol in the past, or our tendency, has been to leave the question and answer aside in these book discussions. So I think we should perhaps follow that today and close now that we've reached the time allotted for our session. But I do again want to thank the.
Yes, thank you so much. Anyway, we'll read the questions afterward.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you all. Yes, absolutely.
For your attendance. It's been great to see you. Thank you, Nemanja. And again, we'll see each other soon. Watch our pages. There are announcements coming. We've just added a new speaker to our Malta session. That's Jack Halberstam. And we have a very nice year coming up. So my best to all of you, and thank you.
Bye-bye.